nostalgic a kind, more like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different life. The kids who share the interest together with a similar kind.
Welcome back to a special episode of Hard NOC Life. I'm not going to waste a lot of time. We're going to dive right into it because we're talking about everyone's favorite comic book television show right now. It's not even on television, but it's everyone's favorite comic television show, and that's Marvel's Daredevil on Netflix. And I have two guests with us. I'm going to go ahead and dive in. We have my brother. He used to write for the Nerds of Color. Doesn't write for us anymore.
I don't really write for
Hails from Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Raymond Chow. Thanks for being on the show. Your favorite Daredevil episode thus far is which one?
Oh, I lost my shit when the hood showed, when the hand showed up. Like, the fact that they just, like, did the smash opening to, oh, he's just fighting red ninjas now. All right, I'm in. I almost threw something at my friend's TV. Like, I almost broke his TV because I was like, oh, what the fuck? No, we're doing this now. Okay, cool.
My other guest tonight is also from New York City. He's a writer for BlackNerdProblems.com. He also contributes to the Nerds of Color. He wrote an article that you probably read in the last week or so for both sites. It's an essay about why watching Daredevil means you can no longer watch anything on the CW anymore. Welcome, Jordan Calhoun, to Hard NOC Life.
How you guys doing?
So you were you even a fan of Arrow before Daredevil?
Accurate. Yeah, I guess it would be accurate to say at one point I was a fan of Arrow. I absolutely loved season 2 of Arrow. It was really, really good. The Arrow for me is one of those shows that I stuck with out of sheer loyalty long after I stopped enjoying it. But it is just something that it comes on every week. I talk about it with a lot of friends, so it just became a habit to watch it, almost just to bitch and complain about it. But it was a staple in my rotation for a while.
Are you watching Flash?
I am watching Flash, and I still love Flash. I mean, not the last episode with the bees, that one was bad. That was filler. But by and large, Flash is still completely entertaining to me, even though it's not like, it's never going to be dark and gritty or Daredevil or whatever the case is, but it's still just a well-written, fun show.
And to be honest, it shouldn't be, right? Because I think the whole point of the Flash and how it even contrasts with the Arrow is that it's supposed to be a little bit lighter, it's supposed to be a little bit funner. But I think a point that you just made about the most recent episode of the Flash being filler kind of plays into like the first point I wanted to talk about in terms of comparing Daredevil and the Netflix model to the shows on the CW, and even to, if you stretch it out even further, thinking about shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. on ABC, which is also part of the Marvel Universe, and even Gotham on Fox, is that broadcast TV kind of has different master, right, to listen to, where you have like advertisers and commercials, and you have to do 22 episodes, so there's going to be filler. Do you think the one of the reasons why Daredevil works so well is that they really get a chance to just do that, you know, Netflix model, that BBC model where it's like HBO model where it's 13 episodes, you get to tell a complete story without worrying about like breaking it up.
Absolutely. Netflix has an inherent advantage when it comes to telling a good, cohesive story with as little filler as possible. And of course, they're going to have more leeway when it comes to realistic language and portrayals of violence and all that stuff. So Netflix, hands down, has an unfair advantage if you're trying to compare, you know, Daredevil to Arrow or any Netflix sort of based drama versus something that's going to be on the CW or major networks. Like it's not going to be like the Netflix show. Chances are it's going to be better because they don't have to stretch a show for 22 seasons or 22 episodes. How good would Daredevil be if it were 22 episodes? If they stretched that story for as long as a season of Arrow or Flash, like it wouldn't be nearly as good. But still, whether Michael Jordan was good because he worked really hard or because he was 6'6", it doesn't matter. He's just better than everyone else. So the fact still remains that for me, Daredevil is going to be the superior show, no matter how you want to, no matter how you want to qualify it.
I think it also kind of reflects the shift that has happened in comics, that with single issues no longer being really the moneymaker, right? And you want graphic novels. The writers are writing graphic novels, and I think that the Netflix model is writing a graphic novel, whereas the broadcast model, the Arrow model, is you're writing single issues, and so there's this certain level of self-containment that and being episodic that keeps it from building and having the same kind of consistency the way that doing it in Netflix and having it all at once can bring you. And like you're talking about like timing, like Netflix. I think Daredevil. They don't know if they're ever going to do another season, and like the Kingpin showing up and like talking. I didn't know when he was going to talk to Daredevil, and that it happened in the episode that it did was
episode 9. It was 23 minutes and 10 seconds into that motherfucker. Yo, I remember the moment in my life when she was like, "Well, why don't you just ask him yourself?" And then he walked in, and then I stood and applauded my computer.
Right. Whereas if this was going on ABC or CW, that wouldn't happen until season 3. Like they would have just danced around it for so long, but because Daredevil is being it has to use a certain economy of storytelling. I mean, Ben Urich would have lived. That's the only event. Ben Urich would have lived like another 6 years if it was on CW. But as it stands, that motherfucker's dead.
By the way, if you're watching this episode of Hard NOC Life, spoilers for Daredevil. If you have not yet, if you had 13 hours of your life that you wanted to actually do things outside in the world and not stare at a television, and you haven't watched all of Daredevil, just be aware that we're going to spoil everything starting right now. But yeah, I think just going off on that point, I think one of the other advantages is that you get the writer Stephen DeKnight and Drew Goddard. Is that his name?
And Christos Gage.
Like, but the writers, the showrunners of Daredevil, they got a chance to sit down, and we're going to write all 13. We're going to write a complete story. We're going to write a 13-act movie, basically, and write it all out, tell that story, and then film it, and then film all the episodes, and then drop it onto your lap all at once. Whereas with like broadcast TV, there's kind of like a rough framework of the story they want to tell, but anyone who's ever watched Lost understands that no one ever really knows the end game.
Yeah.
When they're doing the show, and I think with the Netflix model, you're telling that one story, right, Jordan?
Yeah. I mean, with a network show, you don't know how long it's going to last because you don't know how long it's going to be popular, and the network is going to keep wanting to run that show as long as it's going to be popular and making money. So yeah, you can like. A funny story that I heard about Breaking Bad from Vince Gilligan. I was listening to a different podcast, and he was a guest, and he was saying how he never knew how long it was going to go. So he always had like he had an ending written for season 1. He had an ending written for season 2. Like it was just in a drawer there because he was expecting it to he didn't expect it to go on nearly as long as it did. But then once he figured out that he had some longevity to it, then he was able to fill in those gaps. But yeah, it's going to be an inherent advantage for Netflix shows where you're going to be like, all right, we have this duration of a story. Let's make this coherent as coherent as possible.
So we've kind of talked a lot about the meta aspect of Daredevil and why it works as a Netflix show versus a broadcast show. But let's kind of get down into the nitty gritty a little bit and get into like the, pardon the pun, devil in the details with the show itself and why it works so well. One of the things I think a lot of people are talking about with Daredevil is that it is the most it's unlike anything else in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Everything from the Iron Man films to the Avengers films to even Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Daredevil sits alone in that, and I think that's one of the key selling points of the show for people is that it's a dark, gritty take on that Marvel Cinematic. It's still clearly a part of the universe. They make reference to the Avengers. They make reference to the first film. But it like Jordan said, it exists in a real world where there's like real consequences, real language, real violence. Do you think is that the key for you, Jordan? Why the show works, or is there something else?
No, that definitely helps. That definitely makes it just a more entertaining show. But the things that made Daredevil so good to me were the subtle things of just good acting and writing. So the person who stole the show for me, hands down, was Vincent D'Onofrio as Wilson Fisk. Like him, they took a big gamble writing him the way that they did, because they wrote him as someone who is vulnerable and insecure and emotional and compulsive, when it would have been very, very easy to write him as just this big, brutish goon, right? Like, that would have been the easier Kingpin to write, and that's what we've seen in the past. But making him sort of as complex as he was portrayed, absolutely amazing. And it sort of, I mean, for me as a viewer, it made me realize how good it was when I was watching certain Wilson Fisk speeches and scenes and being like, you know what, maybe he's not a bad guy. Like, I know how the story plays out. Like, I know he's the bad guy. He is the villain. Yet I'm still watching going, and he's actually, like, convincing me of what he's saying. And that's really compelling to see someone on screen who's going to be playing a villain but actually has you sort of second-guessing yourself that way. And then the other thing, just to add on top of his portrayal of Fisk, were that all the characters sort of had their own individual arcs outside of how they related to Daredevil. Like, they all had their own, like, their character development was very well done. The only exception I would say that where I would have wanted to see more of a character's sort of perspective or drive would have been with Claire. I think Claire, played by Rosario Dawson, she was pretty much only there, correct me if I'm wrong, but she was only there, as I saw her, as obviously the object of affection, but the person that was there to help patch up Murdoch whenever he was hurt. But she really didn't have any secrets of her own. She didn't have any, like, drive of her own. Whereas, like, Foggy had his own, like, he wanted to save the world through law. He wanted to improve the conditions of New York City through the legal system. Like, Karen had her own secrets. She murked a man and didn't even tell anybody. Like, she kept her own secrets. Ben, all the different characters had their own sort of angle. Claire, I wish she had more of that, but I cared about all the characters. And that way the writing was done really, really well to me, and it made it for an entertaining show outside of the action scenes, which were obviously amazing.
Well, and I think that was actually a tricky thing that the writers did by casting Rosario Dawson, even if the character itself was a little thin, by putting such a big star in that particular role. Because if you look at, I mean, I guess Vincent D'Onofrio is kind of a big star, but he's more of a character actor. If you look at the cast, Rosario Dawson's probably the biggest star, quote unquote. Yeah. But giving her, like, the smallest role, it's almost like the Marlon Brando effect, where you put the biggest star in the smallest role to give kind of weight to a role that might not be that meaty.
Oh, and it worked. I mean, I loved Claire. I was like it made me want to see her more on camera.
Yeah, I think that they lost a moment, and I don't know if it was because of her scheduling, but, like, after Foggy has discovered Murdoch's identity, and then we're told off the screen Claire came and patched him up. That was a moment that we lost, because it would have been instructive about Claire if we saw Claire interact with Foggy in this situation, right? Because up until that point, the only main characters that she's spoken to is Matt Murdock, whereas everyone else eventually interacts with at least 2 or 3 other characters, and so that you get to see how their personalities kind of change depending on who they're talking to. But she's kind of restricted only to Murdoch through the course of her time.
I didn't think.
Well, and I think if you put the Daredevil story in the series as a whole in the kind of template of, like, the superhero origin story that we've seen throughout the years, if you think of Iron Man, you think of Batman Begins, like, there's always that romantic love interest that the hero is always, you got the Rachel Dawes character is kind of a throwaway character, but you have to give Bruce Wayne some sort of motivation to be Batman, other than the fact that he's Batman, who his only motivation is he wants to stop all crime from happening and not having to save this little assistant DA friend. What I found interesting about
but that's not a good analogy. Don't bring up Christopher Nolan Batman right now. This is the worst time with Daredevil making it bad.
We'll get to that in a second. What I was going to say, though, is that I think, going back to Jordan's point about what the Wilson Fisk angle is, I thought it was really interesting approach to the storytelling by doing the whole romantic love interest motivation story with the villain.
And it did a good job of humanizing him, and you didn't get to see him as just this person who was comically evil and just wanted money and power and everything for himself. Like, a lot of the drastic, most violent things that he did I mean, probably the most violent thing that he did was when he, you know, I don't know how he medically did it, but took off my man's head with a car, like in the car jam, in the door jam. Like that didn't happen out of just like him wanting to set an example for the crime syndicate, or him trying to send a message to Daredevil or anything like that. That was just him being emotional over someone that he was in love with. Like,
right. So you embarrass me in front of the woman I'm trying to impress.
Right. And that's rare for us to see in a villain. I completely agree.
Right, because like you said, like it gives even though the fact that he just took a guy's head off with the car door, you're kind of thinking, yeah, that was kind of messed up. Like, why'd you have to embarrass him?
Exactly. Which makes me feel like a terrible person. I'm like, what does this say about me that I am so easily convinced by this man's speech? Like when he gave the another unexpected thing is when he sort of came out from the shadows, you know, from being the guy who, you know, you can't even say his name in public, to him being in front of news cameras saying his vision for the city. When that happened and he's giving his propaganda speech, and at that point, Foggy and Karen they were always drunk, but they were extra drunk that night. And I was listening to his speech, like, you know, he might have okay, so maybe a few people can die, and I'm okay with that. Like, he was that convincing for me.
We're talking a lot about Vincent D'Onofrio's take on Wilson Fisk, and oftentimes in comic book superhero adaptations, the villain outshines the superhero. You know, going back, I know you don't want me to keep bringing up Batman, Raymond, but like going back to all the Batman films, in most of all the films, it's the villain that outshines the superhero. But I think that in this case, even though Vincent D'Onofrio gives the bravura performance in the show, I think he's shoulder to shoulder with Charlie Cox as Matt Murdock. You know, when I watched that all 13 episodes, there was never a moment where I didn't feel like Charlie Cox embodied Matt Murdock completely and viscerally and totally. What was your take, Raymond, on Charlie Cox's portrayal of Matt Murdock?
I thought he did a really, really good job with, like, Murdock is such a kind of crazy ass character. I mean, like, you know, I mean, that's the thing about Marvel characters, that all Marvel characters are flawed and they all have tragic pasts. But man, Daredevil has he's such a fucking flawed character, and he's got such a tragic past that, like, it in the wrong hands, it's really easy to kind of overdo a lot of things. And I like, maybe my only criticism of the portrayal is that, like, the writers have him say, like, literally say, you know, oh, it's my Catholicism, more than a few times, which, yes, that's absolutely an element, and that's certainly, like, obviously he's talking to a priest, so yes, his Catholicism is important. But, like, more than a few times he says, it's my Catholicism. It's like, that's a little on the nose, but, you know, at the end of the day, we are in a heightened universe, so it's okay. But, like, I think Charlie Cox really earned his stripes in the Stick episode, when he discovers at the end that, oh shit, he kept the band, and then, like, he's just being very pensive and looking out, and, like, that's a good moment there. Charlie Cox really, like, gave you a lot of things without doing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Jordan, what's your take on Charlie Cox as Matt Murdock? And especially how he portrayed Daredevil, like the vigilante aspect. I think that's the other like half of the coin with his portrayal, that he had to be as physical and intimidating as the vigilante as much as he had to be pensive and caring as the lawyer.
Yeah, he did great. He did a great job. There were certain things that were sort of written into the writing where he would go from the scenes where he would go from fondling around and being the blind man as Matt Murdock, and then he would turn a corner and throw a stick and then start sprinting. Like, those were obviously written in, but those were always fun to watch for me. Let me think. Trying to think of a particular scene where he just blew me away. I don't know. I think they definitely did him favors in his portrayal as far as Daredevil by choosing the costume choice that they did. and not having it start off as being something that's going to be more over the top, or him, you know, like in the super tight leather or anything like that. So they definitely did him favors in the superhero like portrayal part by giving him, you know, he's got the mask wrapped around his face and he's just wearing Under Armour that they sort of nodded to on one scene where Foggy found him bleeding and he's like, where did you get all this stuff? And he's just like, the internet. It worked out well.
That also bodes well for the writing and storytelling of Daredevil, whereas most superhero movies, people bitch and moan about, like, Batman doesn't put on the costume for, like, 45 minutes, or, like, you know, Superman doesn't put on the costume for, like, until an hour into the movie. Like, Daredevil doesn't put on the costume until 13 hours into
yep. Yeah. But then that filler episode, exactly, because that filler costume, like, the costume leading up to that was just as dope. Like, it fit in the way that they wrote the story. It fit in really, really well. That he was just, you know, he's not covering his nose, but he's covering his face. No one knows his identity, and he still looks badass. Like, it's not like he was running around in, you know, a t-shirt and sweats. Like, he still had a costume. It was just a basic costume that looked dope.
The costume is an interesting point because, right, it makes you wonder about season 2. Because it means that season 2, you know, he has the costume. He is Daredevil. And you know, the hints of the more mystical, superheroic elements that are part of the Daredevil universe are going to come into play. And it's going to be interesting to kind of, like, clearly with how successful the nitty-grittiness of season 1 was, it'll be interesting to see, now that he is Daredevil, can we keep that tone? Because when he's in the red costume, finally, it's also very much a superhero movie in that sequence. Like, the Kingpin is basically pulling the Joker. He's doing the Joker thing in the middle of the Dark Knight, where he's like, well, I just have an infinite number of people that I can bribe and manipulate, and you cannot stop me. And, like, he becomes very much a supervillain in that moment, the same time that Daredevil finally becomes the superhero. So it'll be interesting to see tonally just how that plays out for season 2. It makes you wonder about season 2, because it means that season 2, you know, he has the costume. He is Daredevil. And you know, the hints of the more mystical, superheroic elements that are part of the Daredevil universe are going to come into play. And it's going to be interesting to kind of, like, clearly with how successful the nitty-grittiness of season 1 was, it'll be interesting to see, now that he is Daredevil, can we keep that tone? Because when he's in the red costume, finally, it's also very much a superhero movie in that sequence. Like, the Kingpin is basically pulling the Joker. He's doing the Joker thing in the middle of the Dark Knight, where he's like, well, I just have an infinite number of people that I can bribe and manipulate, and you cannot stop me. And, like, he becomes very much a supervillain in that moment, the same time that Daredevil finally becomes the superhero. So it'll be interesting to see tonally just how that plays out for season 2.
Like, if you look at the first 13 hours of Daredevil and all the way through to Iron Fist, there is a slow build towards more, you know, like, superpowers and less of, like, the dark and gritty, that when you get to the Defenders, you know, team-up series, that it will be a superhero show more so than it is, like, this kind of, like, Raymond, before we went on the air, said it was like Marvel's attempt at The Wire. That it's almost like they're building towards that, with, you know, because the heroes coming up have progressively more superpowers, right? Like Jessica Jones, and then you get to Luke Cage, and then you get to Iron Fist with, like, the glowing hands and everything. Like, there's going to be, you know, more interjections of, like, the fantastical in this world. Do you think that's going to be a problem if they ever get to it? Like, if Daredevil's season 2 comes after the Defenders, or do you think with the success of Daredevil they're going to try to do another season before they even get to the other shows? I don't know. I don't know how that's going to work.
Yeah, I'm going to be really interested to see how that works. Me, I personally, as much as I love Daredevil, or maybe because I love Daredevil so much, like the 13 episodes that they just did, I almost don't want to see a follow-up season exclusively for Daredevil for a while. Like, let this one breathe for a while because it was great. Like, let that happen, move on to the other characters, and then do Defenders as planned. But I wouldn't want them to fall into the same pit that major networks fall into, like we said earlier, whereas, oh, something's popular, well, let's just start churning it out and striking the iron while it's hot. Like, theoretically that works out, but if they rushed into it and tried pounding out a season 2 right now just because it's popular, I would worry that it's not going to be nearly the level that we could have had otherwise.
Yeah, and I have the concern that the darkness of this is what's making it so successful and so critically well received, that what makes Marvel more effective right now than DC in the cinematic universe and in television is that they are really good at making sure everything has a different tone, right? And I worry that, like, does this mean that they're going to, like, try and make Jessica Jones and Luke Cage and Iron Fist, like, are they all going to be dark, gritty New York stories now, or will they continue to try and make sure that everybody, maybe the other one will be a little bit lighter, and I would hate for them to lose authorial voice in hopes of trying to make everything look the same because something was successful once.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future of Marvel's TV universe, because I think the other thing is, Marvel had been playing catch up to DC when it came to TV, but I think if anything, Jordan, your article has kind of proven that Marvel is starting to surpass DC in the TV game as well. But there is still a question mark around Jessica Jones and Luke Cage and Iron Fist, and I know that Will Evans, who's the editor of Black Nerd Problems, recently wrote a piece about how, if anything, Daredevil's success is really putting kind of like the pressure on the Luke Cage show. Can you talk a little bit about...
The bar is set high.
Right. So what can Marvel and Netflix do to ensure that the Jessica Jones and especially Luke Cage and our angle from Nerds of Color with Iron Fist, and I've long been a proponent for, like, casting an Asian American as Danny Rand. Like, what is the bar is set really high. So where do you see Marvel and Netflix kind of, do you feel like they'll be able to meet that bar? Or do you think that it's kind of set too high? And if they don't meet the bar with, say, Luke Cage, how disappointed will you be in that?
So I would be pretty disappointed, but so I'm going to come from the perspective of someone who had not read those comics specifically. Like, I know very little, to be honest, about Iron Fist. I read some Luke Cage, but mostly as it related to Civil War. Like, I haven't read many Luke Cage titles in the past, and I know next to nothing about Jessica Jones. So, like, my entry-level knowledge on those characters is already going to be low. So where they can excel for me is if they, like, it's going to be based on how well they balance the fantastical versus, like, where's that entry point going to be for a new reader? So with Daredevil, for example, even if someone didn't know anything about Daredevil at all, if they had never read Daredevil, if they were never really interested, you can still watch this and get, like, it was a very basic story when you strip away everything. It's like, how many stories do you know of where the blind person actually sees more than you see, and then they're going out to do X, Y, and Z? Like, it was basic enough at its core that you can watch it and you can see the villain, the antagonist, and Fisk, and it would be interesting and compelling to you. How that is going to be done, or how that could be done with someone with superpowers, like, to the level of Iron Fist, I don't know. I'm curious to see where that entry point is going to be and what they'll need to do for it to be successful for me, because these aren't A-list superhero characters, right? Compared to Cyclops or Wolverine or something like that. So since they're not going to be those A-list level characters, you want it to be where they could do well the way that Daredevil did, is making it an origin story without being an origin story. Like, Daredevil had a lot of origin story aspect to it, and how they were using flashbacks, how they showed him lose his vision or whatever, but it wasn't an origin story in the sense that we normally see it. Like, he was already whooping ass episode 1. Like, it wasn't like we had to learn exactly how he became a superhero and, like, see his struggles on his way. Like, it managed to walk that line very, very well. So what the new series can do is also walk that line well by balancing, like, the really campy extra, superpower aspect of it versus the basic, like, someone can come in and entertain it. I thought it was really done well with Madame Gao, for example. Like, it wasn't until episode 12 or 13 where she laid hands on Matt Murdock and he went flying, 20 yards into the other direction. But long before we saw that fantastical element, we saw someone who was having conversations with Wilson. We saw someone who was sort of complex in being very, very wise, but also being very, very evil or doing terrible things. Like, you're going to have to connect an audience on that basic human storytelling level before you get to the I'm shooting power balls out of my fists.
Right. Well, and I think one of the things with Daredevil, what they were really so effective at, and I think this is the other kind of thing that the people who are loving the show have really glommed onto, is it's the fight choreography. And Raymond, I know that you are a bit of a connoisseur in martial arts films, and what is your opinion on the way that the fight scenes have been choreographed and filmed and shot in Daredevil, and do you see why you had mentioned earlier that the Nobu fight with Daredevil in I think it's episode 10 or 11,
8,
was when you kind of lost your shit. What's your opinion of how their approach to the fight scenes on the show, and how it's different from other superhero properties?
Well, I mean, I think what's important about it is that tonally, depending on who he's fighting, it's the directors are good about giving the fights the right kind of weight. Like, in one segment, he is picking people off one by one by throwing shit at them. In another segment, it's a 10-minute fight fighting one dude. And then in another segment, it's a 15-minute fight fighting 30 dudes. But they all have their own tone. There is an inherent narrative that is different for each fight. The one shot 10-minute fight at the end of the second episode.
The hallway fight.
Oh dear God, yes.
Yeah, like, that fight is more reminiscent of Old Boy or The Raid, but then you have the fight with Nobu where he's fighting a fucking ninja, and like no one's pretending like that's like, it's still got a certain verisimilitude to it. But at the same time, he's fighting a fucking ninja, and like no one like they aren't trying to hide that, and that makes it more entertaining. That makes it more effective, and that also makes it so that when Fisk shows up and just throws him around, that you can really believe that all of these fights matter. All of these fights hurt. Like, Daredevil gets hurt throughout the course of the series in a way that you feel like he could actually lose, and that's an important aspect to giving the fights weight. And in fact, he does lose.
He does, yeah.
And like that, and that's really important, because if you don't have any fear for the guy losing, then you don't care about the fight. It's just porn at that point.
Raymond and I used to be purveyors of professional wrestling, and a lot of times, the in-ring storytelling of the fight of the match gets lost with all the whole like soap opera aspects of professional wrestling. But like those were like mat technicians who can tell a story through the fighting. Like the real kind of like wrestling geeks geek out over that. And I felt like going back to the hallway fight in episode 2, what I really liked from a storytelling aspect is that you always see the superhero take on like 30 dudes and like, it's no big deal. And what I loved about that fight is that you saw how tired and exhausted Murdoch was as he was fighting, and he was still hitting, and he was still punching, he was still throwing people, but you could see it in his body, you can see it in his breathing, and that to me was right. Like, that's what that.
and also that there's a reason why they filmed it that way. Like, not just like, I mean, we were talking about, like, I referenced the Old Boy fight, but really, like, when you watch the Old Boy fight, there isn't really a reason that they're filming it that way. It's just really cool. But in this one, it's because he's running on adrenaline, and it's because he had just been dealt like another defeat, emotionally or storytelling wise. So he's just trying to take some anger out, and that's why, like, he's in this adrenaline moment, and that's why the camera doesn't cut from him, because it's giving you that same feeling. And so, like, it's that's when directing is done right, because the technique that is being used isn't just because it's flashy, but because it serves the storytelling.
I mean, no one is talking. Everyone has blocked the 2003 Ben Affleck Daredevil movie from their minds, especially after watching this. But if you compare the fight scenes in that movie versus the fight scenes in here, like, it's like night and day with the 2003 Daredevil movie. It's all like just like really bad wire work and horrible CGI. Like, basically compare the Nobu Matt Murdock fight to Matt Murdock and Jennifer Garner fighting on a playground in broad daylight.
Yeah, that's pretty much like I erased all memory of the Daredevil movie, and I just have day terror sometimes of the scene with them on opposite ends of the seesaw. Like, that's all I remember. Every now and then I have a day terror, and it reminds me that happened.
So two more points, and then we'll wrap up. The other thing that I really loved about Daredevil is just how many Easter eggs, or I guess a friend of mine called them deviled eggs. I think that's. All of the Marvel Easter eggs that are dropped throughout the series. I think that Jordan brought the comparison to Arrow and how watching Daredevil has made you completely shut you off to Arrow, and I feel like for me, I mean, I already hated Gotham to begin with. That's a show that I hate watch. But I feel like what Daredevil has kind of like shown brightly for me from where DC's failed as a television operation is that if you compare like how Daredevil uses Easter eggs and uses the tone and everything, both shows are filmed in New York City and they use New York City as a backdrop, but Gotham, everywhere that Daredevil drops like really subtle Easter eggs about the Marvel Universe, Gotham hits you over the head with a sledgehammer.
Right. But I think I wouldn't even call them Easter eggs, because the elements that are dropped are not knowing fan service. Like, it's not something so that, like, oh, if you read the comics, here's something that you're going to get that other people are going to get. These are all parts that are help to explain the story. One of my favorite elements of Daredevil is that they explain why we give a shit about Hell's Kitchen. New York City Hell's Kitchen is not like there aren't poor, like, you know what I mean? Like, Hell's Kitchen today, why would we give a shit about, oh, how are you gonna save Hell's Kitchen? Hell's Kitchen does not need no saving. But they explain it.
I love that.
Because they explain it though, because in that universe, oh, that's right, half of New York City got blown away, and so that's like, it's not an Easter egg, it's not a cloying reference, it's a raison d'etre for the story itself, because they wove it into the fabric of it. This
they make the Easter egg relevant to the larger story.
Exactly. So they're not Easter eggs; they're part of the story, and that's what makes it so effective. Is that, like, every element then that gets mentioned is actually building to something else.
But there's still fan service in Daredevil, and they still do it in a much better fashion than on Gotham. So, for example, when he meets Melvin Potter, and like, if you look looking in his workshop, you see like Stiltman's legs, and you see like he's throwing like saw blades.
Right, but exactly, that's not. But my point is, I don't think that that's an Easter egg. I think that's foreshadowing.
But here's how Gotham would have done it, right? when Commissioner Gordon meets Melvin Potter, Bullock will come in and it's like, he's some sort of gladiator. You know what I mean? Like, that's the difference between Daredevil and Gotham, whereas Daredevil, when Foggy says, hey, whatever happened to that Greek chick, Gotham would have added another line, she was electrical. You know what I mean? Like, that's the difference between those two shows.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, I don't know where you stand on Gotham, but I mean, it just, for me, more so than Arrow, that Daredevil has really just shown a light on how piss poor Gotham is as a another take on
Yeah, I don't hate myself enough to watch Gotham.
no, it's you wouldn't do yourself any favors.
Yeah.
I feel like I just do it out of like you were talking about obligation.
Right. You start doing it out of loyalty, but like so part of my article at the end was like just a new realization that I've come to that in the past 10 years, even in the past decade, there are far more shows available. Like there are more shows available now, whereas 10 years ago there was a fraction of the amount of high quality television shows. Like television now is a far more respectable genre with far better stories that rival movies now, whereas a long time ago that just wasn't the case. So I can't waste time on bad shows anymore. Like no one needs to. If there's a show, it's like books. If you're reading a book and it's not capturing you, put the book down and read something else because there's so many other things out there that you could be reading. And that's what I'm going to start taking to television. Like if Arrow lost me, and Arrow has pretty much lost me for good unless all of a sudden people start telling me that, this season 36 that it's on is absolutely amazing and you need to start going back to it. Like there's too much good out there and not enough hours in the day for me to keep up with everything, so I'm going to start picking the things that are absolutely amazing. And there's a lot it's a great time to be a nerd. There's so many things out there on television that are absolutely amazing, so that when a group of writers start jerking you around like I feel that they do on Arrow with his flashbacks and everything that I disagree with on the show, it's like that's fine. Like no hate or shade on anyone who still enjoys it. I wish I can enjoy it, but I don't. So I'm gonna go on to something else.
So I mean, I think it's pretty much consensus that Daredevil is amazing. The thing I do want to leave off on is if there was any aspect of the series that you guys felt wasn't great or they could have improved. If there was something that you were like, I wish they didn't do that.
I'll say two things, and they're not any things that are especially large. One I mentioned earlier with Claire's character development. I really wish that she had more screen time or she had been used as something more than the object of Matt's affection and the object to, patch him up whenever he needed it. Like she was really just there as a tool for him. And they had done so well with the other characters that I wish they would have done it even better with Claire.
Right.
So that would be one thing. The other one was I wasn't a fan of Ben Urich dying, and I especially wasn't a fan of Ben Urich dying based on a mistake that he didn't make. Like, Karen made the mistake of dragging him along. She made the error, and then Ben was the one who got murdered for it. Yeah. And that sort of rubbed me the wrong way. Like, I was so happy that we had a black Ben Urich, and then you kill him off, and it wasn't even like you didn't even write it as a fault of his own. It wasn't really a consequence. On the counter to that, though, just because I always like even leaving off with something positive, was I really, really liked one that Karen murdered Wesley and kept that secret to herself, so that gave her more depth to her character, that she, that was a weight that she was going to carry on her own. And I also liked, and I think a lot of people might not have liked it, but I like how it was done. So Wesley leaves a gun on a table, and on any other show, the villain is obviously going to be 2 steps ahead, and they're extra diabolical, and they would never make a mistake. So she would pull the trigger, and the gun would be empty, or the gun would backfire, or something else, because Wesley was really playing this clever trick that he had no business playing. But instead, he actually did something stupid because he was arrogant,
right?
And he got killed for it. Like there were immediate consequences for his arrogance as a villain. Like it paints a picture of a villain in a way that you don't normally see. Like yes, he's a person that makes mistakes, and his arrogance got him killed by someone who really had no business killing him. So I really liked how that was done. I guess also, since I'm on a roll with the positives, I really love, yeah, since I'm just geeking out now at this point, I definitely like the relationship between Wesley and Fisk, in that Fisk cared about him. It wasn't like Fisk was just using him as, a second. Like he cared about him after his death. It wasn't that he was just going to be using him the entire time to the extent that he can get things from him and Wesley can help him stay rich and powerful. It's again a testimony to the writing of Fisk that Wesley was my friend. Like that was
heartbreaking.
That made you care for Wesley.
Calling his cell phone constantly and he couldn't get him.
Yeah.
Like it was like, oh, I feel so bad for him.
Right, exactly. Like so it makes you one, care for Fisk even more, and two, it makes you care for a character that you otherwise probably wouldn't have cared for that much, because there wasn't that much redeeming about Wesley as a character. At least I don't know if you guys liked him or not. Like I was pretty indifferent towards Wesley, but then the only reason that I cared that he died was because Fisk loved him so much that he's like, he's touching the man's dead body, like trying to figure out how it happened and who killed him and getting his blood on his hands. Like that made me care for Wesley because I cared so much for the overall villain who was actually complex. Right. So yeah, there were a few things that I would have liked better. Claire and Ben dying because of Karen I didn't care for so much, but I did like how Karen killed Wesley, and I definitely liked that Wesley was a character that I cared for because of his relationship with Fisk being genuine.
I'm not crazy about Elena. And I don't mean that I love the character, but what I mean is that I don't know, a lot of people of color are sacrificial lambs on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And her character never really, there isn't really a moment where she isn't. I mean, can I complain about people being kind of, cartoonish archetypes in a heightened universe show? I don't know, but there is kind of this element that like she is conveniently the most innocent and undeserving of all of the horrible things that befall upon her, and that she becomes such a stand-in for just everybody else that were like. Is there a community? There's no one else in that building that was also having a really bad time that maybe we could have also heard about. Not that which isn't to say that like I disliked Elena or I didn't understand what her purpose was, but just kind of like it was all building up to the purpose of having her being killed.
Right.
And that is a little problematic.
Was it just Elena?
Yeah, otherwise that show's pretty damn good.
Otherwise, that's pretty damn good.
Also, I will say that I'm a little underwhelmed with the way that the helmet kind of sits on his head. You know what I'm talking about? Like it kind of, I don't know. It doesn't quite fit right. I mean, maybe just the angle. They do that big like panning angle around on the rooftop, and it just kind of looks like his head shrunk or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
The helmet isn't quite working for me.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the show is so great. Like at this point, it's really just all nitpicks as far as like.
Yeah.
I mean, I was like, Jordan actually took mine. I really wish they didn't kill Ben Urich for a bunch of reasons that Jordan has already articulated. I mean, the main one being that just Bonnie Curtis Hall is awesome.
Agreed.
Such a great Ben Urich. That it was. I almost feel like this was the one kind of like drawback by having all 13 episodes written and having the story already kind of played out. Is that they didn't know they were going to get access to the Spider-Man universe, in a matter of months. And like this is what pissed me off when they killed Ben Urich, is that when he lost his job at the New York Bulletin, I was like, he's getting a job at the Daily Bugle next season. and it didn't happen because Wilson Fisk, caved.
Right. Agreed. I agree with that. Like it's unfortunate, but but did you not go, holy shit, they killed Ben Urich? Anybody can die on this fucking show.
Right. Yeah, it worked.
You didn't think Ben Urich was gonna die, and they fucking killed Ben Urich.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And also, I love that the way that they did it, in that either in that episode or in the episode right before it, Karen Page has that nightmare where Fisk shows up at her house and murders her, and then that's exactly what happens to Ben. And like it's even shot in a similar fashion that like Wilson Fisk has Batman powers.
The reveal of Wilson in that scene though is probably the most chilling.
Yeah.
Like D'Onofrio, every time they revealed D'Onofrio in a scene, it was just amazing. Like the first time you pan across the art gallery and you see his silhouette against that white painting,
Mm-hmm.
and then the way they shoot him inside the car, with you just see his face in the shadows. I mean, every time. I mean, the directors and the cinematographers, really knew how to make D'Onofrio look intimidating. I've read criticisms from people, like just real nitpicky criticisms, that like Fisk isn't big enough and all that stupid shit. Like I felt like that's neither here nor there with his portrayal. I think it's the way the brute force of his when he lets his anger out, and like the complex nature of his the fact they made him like socially awkward was like a really interesting choice, and D'Onofrio's voice and the way he talks to Vanessa versus how he talks to his
and we would be remiss if we did not mention the Good Samaritan story on the finale. Jeez, there's that such beauty in that. If I was a dude, I don't care if I had an assault rifle and a helmet and everything with me. When a villain starts monologuing, you just need to jump out the fucking vehicle. You just need to leave because it's about to go down and it's not going to go well for you. Man started telling the Good Samaritan story, and said, "I am not the Samaritan. I am the man of ill intent."
Yeah,
man, that was just that was such a fun monologue to listen to, and such a fun finale to watch.
The other thing, then, since I can't talk about Ben Urich dying being my least favorite thing about the show, is that I feel like, and Raymond and I talked about this before we went live. The only issue I guess I have about Daredevil is that, and it's kind of like the thing about the Netflix model, is that when you dump all 13 episodes at once. On the one hand, that's the best way to watch it, is to watch all of them back to back to back to back to back, because that's how the show builds. On the other hand, I feel like one of the things that we suffer from by having all of it dropped at once is that the conversation around Daredevil is kind of difficult to have that communal conversation around Daredevil. Say what you will about broadcast TV.
You say as we have a podcast about it right now that people can watch.
The thing about Game of Thrones, like Game of Thrones, or even Arrow, or even Flat, like those shows, is that each episode there's a build up to it, and you're talking about it, and everyone's talking about the same episode. Whereas with Daredevil, it's like, hey, which episode are you on? Oh, you're on that. Okay, I can't talk to you yet. And like, I made sure that the three of us saw the whole thing, and that we're talking about the series as a whole. But where it really struck me is that at Nerds of Color, we're doing weekly recaps of each episode, as if it was being aired for 13 weeks instead of having it all dumped in one weekend. And what I realized is that on Friday we just published the recap for episode 2, and I thought, geez, episode 2 feels so long ago that like right now, if it was a traditional model, we would all be talking about the dope fight scene right now. But for a lot of us, that was like already a week and a half ago, and some people have not gotten, so it's like that model is kind of like, I mean, like I said, it's a real silly nitpick at this point. I don't think you can tell the Daredevil story any other way than the way that they did it, where you have all of the shows back to back. But if anything, I kind of, I didn't, not everyone has 13 hours to devote to a show all at once. It's kind of that's some of the advantages of having it drilled out one at a time. But that said, it's already out. It's in the ether. Everyone loves it. I don't think there's, now the next big rumor is that the Defenders are going to be the next Defenders movie. So that's a possibility. And I don't know how they're going to pull that out. I think you do have to have Daredevil in a Civil War movie. I think it only makes sense. So anyway, that's Hard NOC Life for tonight. I want to thank my guests from Brooklyn, Raymond Chow. You can find him on the internet somehow.
No.
You can find him on Instagram. He is on Instagram. I'd also want to thank my guest Jordan Calhoun, also from New York. You can find him on Twitter at Jordan M. Calhoun. and read his essays at blacknerdproblems.com. Thank you for watching Hard NOC Life, and we'll see you next time.
Well, it's the NOC in full color, you see me? The Hard NOC Life, comics, movies, and TV. Yeah, pop culture with a different perspective. Watch it on your screen, hit play, so check this. This is the Hard NOC Life, but not the chica kind. More like the people in the world seeking perspectives with a different line. The kids who share their interests together with a similar kind. When they said John Glover for Spider-Man, they didn't mind. The activists, directors, comments, and the lectures. Fanboys, professional artists, and professors. Maybe a nerd who's just like you, talking about the things that you like too. So I invite you to the NO.